Thank you so much for joining us today. I am the member of the Executive Committee of New York Southeast Asia Network. My name is Rianne Subijanto, and Emily Tumale here is our organizer from NYSEAN as well. I am so pleased here today. We have gathered scholars of and in of Southeast Asia, and to host this event called the Circuits of Power, Infrastructure, Communication, and Data in Southeast Asia. We have here Professor Cindy Lin, who is going to chair and moderate the event. I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Cindy Lin is an ethnographer and information scientist. Her work centers on the data practices, exchanges, and expertise of climate change and their relationship to environmental governance in Indonesia and the United States. She was also a visiting postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative, as well as a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability and Cornell's Department of Information Science. Dr. Lin's scholarship has appeared in computing venues such as ACM, CHI, DIS, and PD, as well as humanistic venues such as Social Text, eFlux, University of Nebraska Press, and elsewhere. She has co-authored 2 multigraphs, Techno Precarious with MIT Press and Goldsmith Press in 2020, and Digital Energetics with University of Minnesota Press 2023. Professor Lin, the Zoom is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Rianne. I'm here to introduce also my wonderful speakers since I'm only moderating. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Cindy Nguyen. And Dr. Cindy Nguyen is assistant professor at the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, with appointments in information studies, digital humanities, and Asian languages and culture. Her first book, Bibliotactics, which I have here in my hand, Libraries and the Colonial Public in Vietnam, published with University of California Press, uncovers how libraries function as both instruments of colonial dominance and an experimental space of public critique. Her transdisciplinary research examines the historical and socio-technical production of knowledge in Southeast Asia through libraries, encyclopedia, visual media, and language through feminist decolonial and critical approaches. Her work has also appeared in Journal of Vietnamese Studies, Verge, Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy, the Vietnamese American Refugee Experience Modern Curriculum, and numerous edited volumes on history and digital humanities. And she's also the founder of Critical Futures Rest Lab, which explores cultural and computational questions of interpretation and context by centering Global South co-design and multivocal knowledge making. Also a public scholar and community artist, so really excited to hear more from Dr. Cindy Nguyen. And now I'll move on to my next speaker, Dr. Shaoling Ma, who's an interdisciplinary scholar and critical theorist of global Chinese literature, cultural history, and Asian media. Her first book, The Stone and the Wireless, Mediating China from 1861-1906, published by Duke University Press, asks what media studies can gain conceptually from the last few decades of the Manchu Qing dynasty and what this politicized and semi-colonial phase of Chinese history looks like when renewed from the new and mostly foreign communicative technologies of its time, such as telegraphy, telephony, phonography, and photography. She's also currently working on her second book, tentatively titled Asian Loops, which we might hear a little bit about during this session, which looks at the cultural history and critical theorization of how data processing aiding East and Southeast Asian capitalist accumulation and state rationalization transformed rural environments, populations, and cultural production from the late 1950s to the contemporary period. Her writings have also been published in Verge, Comparative Lit, Literature Studies, Critical Inquiry, Positions, and others. I was also a member of advisory board for various book series in Edinburgh University Press, Duke, Pennsylvania State Press, and University of Pittsburgh Press. All right, I'm going to move to last but not least, our wonderful Dr. Rianne Subijanto. who's Associate Professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center for City University of New York, or CUNY. Media historian of Southeast Asia, specializing in Indonesia, her research explores global communication in the context of 19th and 20th century colonialism and capitalism, showing how technologies, infrastructures, and communicative practices are deeply entangled with power, labor, and ecology. Author of The Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, published in Cornell University Press, and co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party, published, co-authored with Ling Hongshuan and Klaus Stugen, published at Leiden University Press. Both great books, everyone should read them. Subijanto also received the 2026 ACLS, or American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, for a current research project, Botanical Media, Gutta Percha, Lonta, and Environmental History of Global Communication. And with that, I would start my biographical introduction of these wonderful speakers. And I would start first with the format. So basically, each of our speakers will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes about how their research, both existing and perhaps upcoming, have really reinvigorated the field of Southeast Asian studies and the respective fields that they are part of, right? So we'll start with Dr. Cindy Nguyen, then Shao, and then Rianne. And then we will end follow that up with a moderated discussion of about 3 questions, and then we'll have Q&A at about 1 p.m. EST time. So yeah, Dr. Cindy Nguyen, do you want to start us off with some answers to the first question?
Sure, thank you. Can folks hear me okay? Wonderful. It is such an honor to be here in dialogue, and I'm just so excited. This is definitely one of the events that I've been looking for throughout a very difficult time in the term. So this is yeah, I've just been really honored to be here. Before I forget, I just wanted to share in the chat links to the book as well as the book website. So I made this website for my book called bibliotactics.com, and it's there that you can also find links to the digital version and also the paper zine that I created. You know, I wrote this book on history of books, so I have all this so here's a book, and then here's like all this paratextual things that I made about the book, a zine, some book leaflets and quotes. So there's some digital material that I also look at as paratextual material to the experiences of reading. And I think a lot about that. And we might, as a panel, might think about that too, like in writing an academic book and in doing these public panels and engaging across different books and looking at where we've been and where we're going in terms of our scholarship is like a paratext of the scholarly work and thinking about kind of the continuities of our knowledge production and the collaborative ways that that evolves. So yeah, so that's on Bibliotactics, and there's actually a fuller length recording of a talk that I did recently that's there, as well as my email. So kind of in attempting to answer these big questions that I've really been reflecting on, to speak about writing bibliotactics, libraries, and the colonial public, in Vietnam, I think it's really important for me, at least, to reflect on what it means to write across 3 fields. So the first one being Southeast Asian Studies, in which I was trained in as a cultural historian specifically. So it's the field in which I work with most deeply. Yeah, I think in invigorating the field, it was really, and in writing this book, key to have an interdisciplinary conversation. So the second field in which I engage with really deeply is colonialism and post-colonialism. And the third field that I engage with is histories of reading and information infrastructures. So I don't think the book would not be the book it is if I didn't work really capaciously across those 3 fields. It would be such a different book if I was even just working on as a historian in Vietnam. But I really wanted to bring in scholars like Justin McDaniels thinking about Buddhist reading, Leah Price, who's thinking about what it means to do things with books in a British context, and really like troubling notions of coloniality, from thinking about kind of space from like Hannah Arendt in terms of performance to kind of Nancy Fraser in troubling kind of the patriarchal ways in which we think about publicity. So I think it really like kind of challenged that. So I mean, I'll get into the book a little bit before we kind of, and then you'll see how I kind of directly engage with it. So the core argument of the book is that and what I do is I uncover the emergence of a colonial public that is brought together within a French colonial institution of the library. So the colonial public are the builders and the users of the library, French and Vietnamese government bureaucrats, library personnel, journalists, and everyday library readers who are committed to defining the political role and everyday meaning of this public library. Yet I trace how these direct interactions within this space formalize a cultural and political consciousness that tied together three elements. You had public space, publicly accessible reading matter, and the public as this notion of a collective that then ultimately shaped this vision of Vietnamese nationhood and collective identity. So that's kind of the core arguments, and we can tease out how that's done later. Yeah, in the methods of how I do that and the theory of how I do that is I advance this concept of bibliotactics. I use that concept to characterize what everyday agency looks like for both the builders and the users to articulate this meaning of the public through shaping the policies and the use of this library. So here I'm already troubling this notion of top-down versus bottom-up power, right? So this concept of bibliotactics then advances a relational and multi-directional theory of power that blurs this arbitrary divide between who the rule makers are and the rule breakers, the colonial state and the colonial subject. So actually, I often think about this cover here, who features a librarian who is going into the book stacks to retrieve a book for a patron. We don't know who that patron is. Yet, what I really wanted to feature in this book, and actually the human elements of this, is that this individual, this Vietnamese individual, represents a set of different range of bibliotactics of behaviors and actions who kind of defy this notion of like pro-colonial or anti-colonial and operating within an institution. So he embodies a range such as another librarian whose name is Le Thi Vinh, who then regularly arrived late to work, stole a bunch of books, and would read during work hours. So I think about individuals like Le Thi Vinh, whose everyday actions, do they reflect a resistance or a negotiation within this institution of colonial dominance? So then the chapters follow a historical structure, focus on these 5 practices. The first is to document. The second is to be in public. The third is to circulate. The fourth is to read. And the fifth is to reassemble. And through this structure, I hope that bibliotactics both does 3 things. It is a theory of power, and it's a set of historical practices that I'm tracing over time. And then I hope, and it kind of reflects in my training and where I'm teaching now, is that it could also have a reflection on contemporary praxis in terms of library and information studies today, which is where I'm teaching, like future librarian, memory workers, archivists. So in longer talks, I usually focus on these 3 elements in my work, which is understanding the historical context and information infrastructure, the vision and the structure of the library system, specifically looking at the Hanoi and Saigon Central Libraries. And I kind of build up this discussion, and I call this the colonial information order. So these are key things in tracing the infrastructure of the library system that was very tied to the archives. In the second and main part, I show how these library infrastructures, the reading matter, as well as the urban centrality, in Hanoi and Saigon, gave rise to this distinct public reading culture, which then shaped Vietnamese political project of libraries, literacy, as well as nationalism. And then I conclude with a discussion of decolonization of libraries or the post-colonial northern and southern Vietnamese states to rethink and temporalize decolonization. So my time period in which the book covers is 1917 to 1958, which is very, quote, non-traditional in Vietnamese studies, which either end in 45 with the end of World War II and the declaration of Vietnamese independence, or 1954, the end of the First Indochina War. And I ended 58 because I traced the infrastructures of the Hanoi and Saigon libraries and the people who move within those infrastructures. And there in itself is another contribution in kind of re-problematizing or problematizing and retemporalizing what Southeast Asia studies could look like. And I know I was supposed to keep track of time, and I know Cindy, could you give me like how many minutes so I just know how far to 2 minutes, perfect. Yeah, so the narrative arc of this book is really about following, it's a story about infrastructure, but really a story about people and practice within those infrastructures, right? Or the cultural life of reading. It's through this kind of troubling of top down, bottom up, or infrastructure and cultural practice that I could then examine what power looks like, both in the kind of structures as well as the everyday actions, and tracing through the disassembling and reassembling of those structures in the post-colonial period. So I'll just conclude with thinking about like the methods, because I think it points to Southeast Asian studies as a field and where we are in this space. There were, I'm trained as a historian, and there were these certain moments that were very defining in the archival work. And one was finding a folder of folders of draft statistics of reader visits in pencil, right? So there were so many of these kind of documentary actions, and kind of actions, misactions, misrecordings that were recorded within the library. And I saw that is a kind of a science technology studies, like knowledge in the making, that and a science that was evolving, which is specifically documentation and library sciences. And I draw from Jacqueline Warnemont, who works on histories of quantification, as something that's not simple or a transparent act, doesn't reveal truth, but as an interpretive and creative practice of world making. And this is Jacqueline, who's talking about choices of who to count and what to count authorizes and limit individual and collective knowing and being, and power is expressed and performed through quantification. And that really was informed my method throughout a kind of this meta history of also examining these infrastructures as kind of a science of quantification was evolving. And the other kind of moment in the history was that um, you know, thinking about another folder of all these petitions to reinstate library privileges, where people were saying for this and that reason their library privileges were taken from them, and there were these very human elements. And most cases, even with years of requesting the library privileges to come back, basically they were rejected. So this is like very bureaucratic ways in which power was executed in terms of a colonial state, yet the tedious everyday actions of these individuals to still operate within and against these library structures and thinking about how reform might exist was really informative to how I shaped the overarching book. And I call this push against kind of the datafication of the colonial subject as a data fiction. So I draw from kind of creative and fictitious ways. I'm looking at Xiao here of thinking about what it means to write histories of libraries and information. And I'll conclude with that, so I could hear from my wonderful panelists.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cindy. Now I'll pass the floor to Dr. Shaoling Ma. You can take us away for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for this whole opportunity. I will try to go a little shorter. So I think I will, at the outset, talk about my strange entry point into Southeast Asia, despite being, raised there. So first, I'll start with the academic, more professional stance. I think it was writing my first book that Cindy Lee so generously introduced that, and I'm sure everyone shares this experience, that as an area studies scholar interested in media studies, you're constantly asked to justify your research area and your method, right? And over time, I've come to embrace and not fear this burden and take it as a challenge to really confront how media theory and the arbitrary distinction to media history has been institutionalized and historicized, right? So again, a long-standing debate between theory and history as such, even if you're not working in the field of data studies or media studies. And having constantly to justify it, I become increasingly interested in how this idea of area is really caught up and inseparable from the question of disciplines, as something that Cindy just mentioned in the beginning of her talk. That we can't think about the trans-regional, or even to think about what constitutes a region. And for Southeast Asia, it is entirely fictional, as Cindy also left us with. We can't begin to unravel this problem of area, this problem of history, this problem of the trans-region, if you like, without thinking about the kind of epistemological fields that come to undergird these areas. And I'll explain what that means. So I was trained in comparative literature, and so my training has always been very theoretical and literary and cultural, and even philosophical in the early stages. And when I began, interested in media studies, and the dominance was a kind of cinema studies framework, right? Cinema, film studies. And the kind of emphasis given to new media and its appearance and its emergence and its adoption in China and the rest of Asia has always obviously focused on the kind of the question of a cultural lag, right, behind North American and European use and innovation. And that to me really obscures the fact that media is really both a medium of representation, but also really a means of production, right? Once we kind of get out of, again, what was my exposure to certain defined technologies, such as photography, such as cinema, and the kind of archives that they leave behind, right? That I was kind of privy to, and I knew how to work with. And that to me, what it obscures was equally, if not more interesting, which is that any technological media, besides being able to represent itself, and I feel like that is especially reflexive, is also a means of production, right? And I think media as a means of production, maybe it's just not as sexy, or because again of disciplinary differences, right, has now been taken up in the kind of scholarship that I was working through in my first book. And I think that's what The Stone and the Wireless was really edging me towards by the time I finished the book, and somewhat along the last chapter of our writing, I think. And this is really something I tell younger scholars all the time. Then you realize what your book's about. And I think I finally realized it a few years after it has come out, that I continue to be intrigued by the way that media technologies and communicative media, to repeat, straddle its dual functions as a medium of representation as well as a means of production. And the way that the straddling and the kind of mudding of the two fields and the two distinctions also speak to a disciplinary and an interdisciplinary interest in both, the continuing power of aesthetics and cultural representation and form, but also in a kind of Marxist political economy. And so I think it's bringing together the kind of lessons that I learned writing the first book, and also my desire to really do a more trans-regional work for the upcoming project, for this ongoing project, actually, that I've come to land on this topic of Asia in loops. And unlike Cindy, I don't have a beautifully formed description of the book, but I'll try my best to tell you what's about, but also how I came to it. So I think the fascination with like technology before it's fully formed and understood has always fascinated me, and which is why media archaeology was a very formative methodology for me for the first book. I have not relied on the term so much currently for many reasons, one of which is I don't think it makes for very sharp political critique. But having said so, I remain fascinated and drawn to kind of earlier periods of a certain technology before it has fully taken form or fully grasped by its users, right? So I started this second project thinking, okay, I want to trace like the early cultural history of computing in East and Southeast Asia. And once I start with that, my archives showed me that from the early 50s on, computing and data processing was really incorporated by Taiwan, PRC, the Philippines, and Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore onwards. The time kind of stretches in areas of agricultural production and agronomics. And along with that, all the kind of data surveying of agrarian rural populations, right? And also resource management. So it goes beyond a certain quota of extractivism because it really, is about the rationalization of smallholder rice production, sugar plantations in Taiwan with its Japanese colonial legacies, but also very importantly, land development. So as early as 1953, the Philippines land agencies were really using early Remington and IBM machines to conduct cadastral surveys for land so that they could measure and publicize properly uh, where somebody's ownership of the land begins and end. And this is all to aid in a kind of what is called land redistribution, but really was mainly land redevelopment. And a lot of it was to circumvent the kind of really tricky issue of how to actually take land back from elites and redistribute them. And that was not actually done, as you can imagine, because of the kind of ongoing inequalities and the power that the landed elites held, both in government and in business. But how to then actually look into unpopulated forested land to kind of re-demarcate it. So that's just one example, one case study. And I am not trained as an agrarian scholar, but this became the direction for the project. So in short, it became a project about data processing and land politics, data processing and agricultural production, and also data processing and the management of rural resources at large. And I was super excited and remain very excited to, learn an entirely new field and to really converse with agrarian scholars in Southeast Asia. And many amazing work are done here by my colleagues here at Cornell and the Southeast Asian program, which I'm amazingly grateful for. And obviously, having to straddle so many disciplines is really, really frightening. But I keep on emphasizing that I'm not trying to be an agrarian scholar, but I'm really interested in how computational technologies increasingly rationalize and re-represent the rural worlds of Southeast Asia as something that is contiguous and in fact indispensable to urban development, right? So any kind of serious study of the rural in this region will tell you that the kind of rapid economic narrative that is Southeast Asia and Asia from the period of the 70s onwards have been closely dependent upon the kind of rural surplus extraction, but also the freeing up of rural labor to work in these urban factories, right? And this is the same case in China too, with the reform period. So, but yet how that history is actually tied to the history of computing has not been explored, right? I.e., we all know that it is from developing rural societies into industrialized urban centers that the money flows, right? But how computing actually played a big role in aiding that transition is something that this project tries to do. And going back to how media is both a means of representation as well as a means of production, it's almost as if data processing and all the kind of archives that spring around the representations of data processing. And here my project relies a lot on old industrial documentaries. So IBM always produces a lot of, IBM Southeast Asia actually has a lot of documentaries, short industrial films on computing in Southeast Asia. Governments themselves have done that. So the Philippines, in order to commemorate its anniversary of its land department, has released documentaries on these early computing usages. So through these documentary forms, and of course, like government papers, US aid agency papers, we get an entire archive that not only shows the importance of computing, but also shows the way that the technology itself is overrated in many ways, meaning that what data processing did was simply to rationalize, account for, yes, abstract, quantify what is inherently a kind of political and economic altering of labor divisions, for example, right? So because the project traces the 1950s all the way to the contemporary period, it spans so many decades and it spans so many different countries in the region. I'm very conscious of how kind of maximalist I always say this project is. But I think what computing does is it's not just the bad guy, right? I'm not just saying that computing, which involves so much like Cold War aid, and also obviously proprietary profit making in the process. Does not just abstract social relations, does not just quantify them, rationalize them, and make them profitable for both governments as well as private enterprises. I think that argument is well established. It does not just exploit labor, it does not just create, the loss of jobs, but that it also exposes its own lie, right? It also reveals the fact that it is, in fact, a means of production that simply was implemented to aid in the extraction of capital, right?
Thanks so much, Shah. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I think really from Cindy and we're getting a sense about how to develop a methodology to understand theory of power within colonial libraries. And then from Shah, really getting a sense about what does it mean to do an early computing history in East and Southeast Asia from the context of agriculture and land development, right, which requires a very particular set of methodologies. And to end off with our short little spiel around how disciplines are being reinvigorated through our various projects, we have Dr. Rianne Subijanto.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you so much to everybody for being here, and also to Xiao and Cindy Nguyen. I'm just so thrilled. Just a backup story. Xiao and Cindy and I, Cindy Nguyen and I, we all met on the same day at NUS in Singapore. And we were excited because apparently we shared the similar fields, and we were all studying Southeast Asia. And of course, all of us know Cindy Lin. So all four of us got together last month or 2 months ago at AAS and prepared this panel. I'm also, though, feel very honored to sit here with you all, because just now, after hearing Xiao and Cindy, and I've heard a little bit also about Cindy Lin's work, that we are all field transgressor. Our project is we want to transgress all of these boundaries of disciplines and that have been, put on us. And I feel, I'm going to add to that story. What my reflection is actually going to be based on two work. My first book, the one that is about history of Indonesian communism, and yes, Cindy has the book, and also the second one is my current project on botanical media, which I hope I can explain a little bit later. But really, when and Cindy Lin has given us brilliant questions, which helped me to really reflect on who I am, actually, my portfolio as a scholar. So my explanation might be a little bit more, broader than focusing so much on my work. But hopefully later I can give some case studies and details. So I'm going to actually start with a description of my profile as a scholar and what really enables me to be this discipline transgressor, right? So I'm a student of three fields. The first is Marxism. Karl Marx's early work, I mean, all of his work, but also early work, especially really shaped the way I think about the world, it's a philosophical understanding, it's a method of thinking, in that I see human history as a product of the interaction between human labor and land or nature, right, as the environment. So through labor, we humans uses nature as the object of our labor to create our means of sustenance and to produce and reproduce ourselves and the society. So in this case, labor on the one hand and land or nature on the other are key to our metabolic reproduction, not just of the society, but also the material world we are living in. I mean, that's just a very simplistic summary of it in one sentence. But also, of course, I follow also, the people who expand Marx thinking and Marx work. So if Marxism is my method of thinking, media studies is my multidisciplinary field of inquiry. And you might notice that I say multidisciplinary here. It's because media study is a field since its very inception has been informed by approaches and questions from multiple disciplines, media or communication or information or what they mean and what they entail for the society is what unites us. But really, there is not really we don't actually necessarily agree with each other in terms of what the definition or the approaches itself. That's why it's multidisciplinary. And as you see, all four of us have our own understanding and definition and, and trajectory of media and communication. But so how do I understand media and communication? So I started by explaining how human history, in my view, is a metabolic product of labor and nature, right? But also, in my view, the organization of our social, cultural, and political economic lives, including, our emotional and psychological, lives in that matter, is all produced, reproduced, challenged, and renewed through signifying practices, through communication. And just like Shao, we both are actually we joke about it. We both are Raymond Williams girls who coined this term of media and communication as means of production. So when we think about it, this includes both interpersonal communication, such as language, songs, gestures, and symbols, but also mass media, from the institutions and infrastructure of communication down to the design of particular media technologies and their affordances. So in short, again, if I simplify it, society is a form of communication in which all processes of production and reproduction involving human labor and nature are discursively mediated. And discourse does not mean symbolic or immaterial. It's very much also material. So when peasants were cultivating land or when they were protesting the control of land, they all occur in communication, either mediated through media technologies or through interpersonal communication. Now, While Marxism is my method of thinking and media and communication studies is my multidisciplinary field of inquiry, Southeast Asian studies, particularly Indonesian history, is my empirical world. Right. So these three combined, I find, is the core of my, fields that shape my scholarship and also that enable me to defy any kind of boundary makings, because just like what Xiao and Cindy has mentioned, each of these, especially Southeast Asia, South Asian studies and media studies, they all have their own boundary making attempts, right? And we're trying to continue to defy them, and it's really productive in my view. So now to the question that Cindy asked, how does both Southeast Asian studies and media studies, how do they invigorate each other? I'm going to start by identifying two problems in the study of media that I have written elsewhere. The first is an obsession to what David Morley calls, and I'm agreeing with him, cultural presentism, which is this fascination for communication technologies of the present. So we often hear terms like digital revolution, the information age. Now today we are in the age of AI, right? All of these studies are often done with little regard for the historical continuities of past technologies and their attendant logic that still shape contemporary communication. And Lisa Gilterman's book here, Always Already New, is useful to challenge this as well. Another problem is the media-centric tendency in the field that focuses exploration on directly observable cases of media. And this often neglects the long durée of the historical development of communication. And I'm influenced by Williams, who say communication is a whole complex assemblage of different modes, practices, and variations of communication to facilitate connection and exchange, including, of course, economic, cultural, etc., etc. And in my work, instead, I think about connection and exchange beyond these directly observable cases of media to also include transportation, for example, which is an important mode of communication in rural places. Or today, now, with my current project with botanical media, to think about trees. How do we think about trees as an integral part of media studies? So these Asian studies also allowed me to think about media differently. It helps me to think about media and communication in a broader context of a people that have had a long history before Western power arrived in the early 1500s. We can't really talk about media studies in Indonesia and just talk about, radio, television, and, and digital media, Facebook, etc. Because there have been people who actually the oldest cave painting was found in an island in Celebes in Indonesia, right? So, and before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, the two worlds, the American continent on the one hand and Africa, Europe, and Asia on the other, were very much unconnected. And during this time, the archipelagic Southeast Asia was already among the oldest maritime trade network. And Southeast Asia was an important producer of key products like spices, like pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and other goods, right? So Southeast Asia was already a center of a very rich and thriving maritime trade, connecting China with India and Africa through to Europe. And people in Southeast Asia also had already have developed their sophisticated systems of communications, including ships, boat building technologies, and navigating practices that were attuned to seasonal monsoon wind cycles, which enabled this regular movement across the regions. So just to bring that, to say that there is a whole world of communication and media that is ready to be unearthed, in media studies. The Southeast Asian studies also made possible to root media studies to land and labor. I think this is also very important. I want to mention, when we study, I still teach my students this idea of media ecology, right? What it means is media ecology often focuses on, Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, of these people that develop media studies. They focus on how media technology and its affordances transform our senses and our psychology. But all of these technologies are often told from this directly observable cases of media and also from the perspective of technological prowess and technological innovation. But if we look at it from the perspective of Indonesia, media studies are actually about raw material extractions. And raw material here means both the labor, the human labor, and natural resources. You know, the oldest electronic media, telegraphy, right? When we read the books on it, we will learn about Michael Faraday or, Werner von Siemens, all of these inventors, right? But it didn't mention that it was made possible by a tree called Gutta Percha, which is the subject of my study today. A Malay tree, it's native to the archipelagic Southeast Asia, that produced sap, and the sap was used to insulate the copper wire so that then it can be laid out under the sea. And so this is the story of media studies from Southeast Asia, you know, the extraction of this tree, and also that continue until today with internet infrastructure, electronic devices, all of them need, you know, continue to extract nickel, for example, a key natural resources for this technology. So while we are obsessed with digital media evolution or revolution, you know, of media and the seemingly rapid changes of technologies, the story of media studies from Indonesia remains the same. It continues to be a provider of raw materials, of this massive extraction. And this paradoxical view, I believe, cannot be separated. They both create a more complete picture of the media and communication world that we live in. And this picture is a product of the broader system of colonialism and imperialism that has continuously reproduced until today. I have just one more point, and then I'm going to end. Southeast Asian studies also invigorate media studies with cases of community media. You know, for example, lontar. Lontar is palm tree, and the leaf is used to produce manuscripts. And this has been used since the 5th BCE, you know, across the Indian Ocean world. So through interconnection and exchanges from the Indian subcontinent to Tibet to Central Asia to Indonesia, it has served as a medium for recording and transmitting knowledge. And its global reach, you know, and we have to think about global here in a different way, right? Because there was already globalization too before European arrived, and that emerged through trade and cultural exchange with techniques of lontar making co-produced and adapted by local communities over centuries. So if we use Nicoldry's definition of media as infrastructure of connection, Southeast Asian humans, you know, and their species, you know, human and non-human species, they're already among the oldest producers of this infrastructure and practices. And very shortly, media studies also invigorate Southeast Asian studies. And I will expand this later, but a lot of area studies, just like Xiao has mentioned, has been shaped and determined by Cold War narratives. And media studies give us a lens to go beyond political and discursive borders and beyond the nation states. And I do this both in my book and my current project. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rianne, for such a comprehensive view about how these two different disciplines kind of commingle, right, and produce something kind of different and transgressive. And I know that we have, and I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So actually what I'm going to try to do to attempt here is maybe collate two of these questions together so that all three of you could maybe speak towards it. And then Rianne actually hinted and gestured at this, and maybe this is for my own selfish reasons because I'm in the College of Computing. I teach computer scientists, right? And computer scientists, you know, they, strangely enough, might appear that they might be part of this presentism, right? This problem of presentism, which is that we are in a new revolution. We are in a new age of something. But my students actually want to know more, and they want to know about the continuities as well as discontinuities between older media, information, library, and communication infrastructure with what we might call AI today. So I want to get you all, maybe each of you, to say like a few words about how, you know, when you're approaching your study, right, when you're trying to trace some of these continuities and discontinuities, right, which we haven't mentioned so much of, right, what are discontinuous between older forms of communication, media, and information infrastructure with more recent ones, right? How do our various studies bring in methodologies, right, or methods or ways of knowing that can help us get at some of these disruptions, as well as kind of like long entrenched structures of either power, right, in Cindy Ann's case, or about production, right? Which if you think about generative AI, right? I mean, all of us think about it in terms of a consumptive lens, but actually, it is about production, right? In some ways. So perhaps each of you, and maybe we'll start with Cindy Ann first, just to give Rianne a break, and then we'll go with that order. Just in thinking about, how do our various projects, both existing as perhaps ongoing, help us to get at some of these continuities and discontinuities, and then what approaches or ways of thinking or methodologies do we bring in to think about either it in terms of power or in terms of production, right? I think this could help some of our listeners, right, to really understand what is it about our various case studies, empirical studies, to use Rianne's word, and also ways of thinking that we can lend anew to some of these questions that are very pressing today, I would argue.
Wonderful, wonderful question. And I know there's just so much to engage with here. I think I'll make kind of two core points to this. So I wear a lot of hats, and sometimes I get confused as to which hat I'm wearing. But so I was trained as a historian, and then while I was trained as a historian, I did outside fields in digital humanities and data science, as well as was very deeply informed by STS and colonial post-colonial studies. And I have that long time process of working on different types of digital humanities types projects. And so I think about kind of the making aspects of digitality and digital research processes for quite some time. Yet as I've transitioned now to, I pursued those two paths and then wrote this book. And then now I'm teaching and in future librarian archivist memory workers. So working very closely with forms of both production and preservation of knowledge and transmission of knowledge through training future librarian archivists. So that's on one side. And I also teach in the digital humanities program at UCLA. So much of my thinking, my sense is I almost feel like I've gotten, along with my students, another PhD in whatever this world is that we're living in terms of the relationship to computing and knowledge production. Yet I still go back to my historical training of empire and thinking about specifically two concepts of context and ongoingness, right? So we think about the importance of studying colonialism and the importance of context, of history, of people, yet recognizing incommensurability as core to that. So what situations are unique and income measurable and cannot be equated? So kind of with all the discourse around decolonizing everything, we lose that, we're losing farther and farther from the historical context and importance. And the ongoingness, what are the shadows of empire? What are the ways in which this has a lingering impact? And I see that two-part framework useful to think about the technological moment we're living in. So what are the specific contexts that are actually tied to material, individual human elements that should not be equated? And then what are the legacies? So kind of just because that's one kind of framing. Another framing I think about is because it comes a lot from my classroom experience and my long-term working with digital technology within my research, which I didn't, it wasn't directly in this book, but I have published a lot on digital humanities methods, particularly in ways of thinking about digital visualization and in the hermeneutical and interpretive ways that computation and computational modeling might afford and not augment, but just be part of the journey of knowledge production. So I think of this humanistic and computational in this very hands-on, praxis-based way. that doesn't take apart the critique from the creation, but it's very interwoven. And I think it's really hard that, because I've been working on this for such a long time, and then now there's all this AI conversation. And what I'm seeing though is that AI has become this kind of big cloud that we're not talking about the same thing. It's like it's coming at us from different ways, from like scholarship to academia and or the classroom and kind of surveillance technologies, that we're losing kind of the material context of its production and its histories. So and then I'm just reflecting like the kind of warnings of AI that I've seen that are quite alarming, that have historical context too, is that I think a lot of the challenges with AI, and even as it's being kind of latched on to different types of thoughtful critical research work, is that it's very solutionist oriented. It's a solution looking for a problem, right? And as teachers, we're seeing this, where AI is tacked on to kind of solve usually labor problems. But it's not sold to us like that. It's sold to us through like efficiency and effectiveness. And I think in this type of panel too, I just appreciate like being on this panel of Marxists too. Like I think ultimately that's the story. The story of AI is a story about labor. Um, yeah, so like bringing it back to the students in that way and being really thoughtful, and kind of my other hat is deeply engaging with technology. So I've like really thought about like, how to engage with this. Like I do the critical work, yet I really want to be part of the world of making too. And part of that is like feeding into this lab that I've formed, which is more like a research garden. We have a bunch of seeds and we're planting it and like we'll see what happens. And it's called Culture Futures Rest Lab. And the rest here is global rest, like global south, in terms of kind of an expansion of and decentering of the knowledge produced. That's like working against both Gen AI models and like data is trained on, attention to labor and where the labor for kind of employing and producing these models are actually coming from. And then the rest and this feminist praxis of what rest and resistance could look like in terms of resisting capitalist forms of knowledge production. And what this looks like is in the form of thinking about the classroom, so pedagogy, and bring my students in working with community engaged projects. So like, I just conclude with this because we have time for other answers, is that really thinking about partnering with different types of organizations that are doing this type of digital humanities, data, and Gen AI type work on the ground. So I've been working with two organizations in Southeast Asia, an AI of our own that reimagines Global South AI, and Southeast Asian Arts Equator, which is a organization that tracks violations of artistic suppression and makes legible that from a civil society perspective. And then I kind of group my students with kind of critical computing and partnering with these community organizations to create something new that's like community designed. So that's kind of like a principles form of how I'm trying to work through all of this mess in the classroom.
Amazing, Cindy, and I'm so thrilled to hear about the art space kind of research that's emerging from what you're doing, and really the emphasis on praxis and how that's still made possible in university institutions. I think that would benefit a lot of us listeners here. Shao or Rianne, whoever who wants to go first in answering that question, please feel free to go ahead.
Yeah.
I will jump in very quickly since we left off, or Cindy left us off with on the subject of art and creation. I am nowhere as talented, so I'm still doing the kind of critical seat. But I am really interested in how digital new media art forms, especially coming from Southeast Asia, with its regional history of art history, but also city-states like Singapore, trying to kind of be the seat of Southeast Asia contemporary art, right? And what it says about its own lack of a national art history. So I can say more about that in the Q&A, but I think it's really symptomatic when the kind of really plethora of a lot of exciting digital media art that has been coming out of Southeast Asia, fully embraced. A lot of these use of ChatGPT, AI, and for critical means, right? They use it to, unravel a certain like older, more sedimented history of media technology in colonial and post-colonial periods. It kind of these kind of works, one of which is a Singaporean artist I write about, points to the longer kind of racial ethnic politics in British Malaya, but also post-independence Malaysia, for example. But at the same time, while fully kind of incorporating these the use of drones, for example, the use of virtual world simulations such as Unreal World, and so on and so forth. And it's symptomatic of what is really kind of real subsumption, right? When all forms of spheres of social production and reproduction have been subsumed under the dominant mode of production. But at the same time, the subsumption is never full because it always points to these ongoing agricultural production, for example, that is also now being purported to be the new area of smart technologies, drone technologies, if you think about smart agriculture, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of a kind of dilemma I face as a critic about how to see new media works, especially a lot of Southeast Asian video art that I engage with as reflecting just how dominant this current mode of production is, while also kind of allowing me to tease out the thread of these remnants, not just of colonial resource extraction. In the case of Malaysia, it is the rubber plantation that I talk a lot about or write a lot about in my current project, but also the kind of ongoing need to situate agricultural production alongside these kind of technological advances. So that's just kind of one configuration that I'm working with, and I'll pass it over to Rianne.
Yeah, Rianne, I have a question for you, and I think maybe this can be directed to everyone as well, because I'm trying to compile the questions before we open up for Q&A. And I think it kind of speaks to everyone's work, but I think you end off really telling us a little bit about what media theory from Asia will look like, and really looking at this question around extractivism or raw materials as kind of a key nexus in which one can think about computing differently or think about media infrastructures differently. And perhaps you can give us a little bit of an answer to like what does a media theory from Southeast Asia look like?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I want to just say very quickly that even though I don't, I think all of us have our own, roles in the society, right? Like I think even though I don't produce, I'm not art crafty like Cindy, but I'm also involved in Indo Progress collective. It's a media left collective, and I think we focus a lot on shaping an agenda, not just of research agenda, but also movement agenda. And I think that's the kind of role that I see myself doing. But to your question on media theory, what does media theory from Southeast Asia look like? And this is something that a lot of scholars are especially, they have to come up with a theory. Like, in this capitalist, ultra individualist, all about superstar and the creation of celebrity scholars, but here is and because this is a conversation, I want to say something very controversial, which is in my view, there is no media theory of Southeast Asia, and it shouldn't be our goal either to create theory. And of course, Cindy, this is not what you mean by your question, but I just want to take it as an opportunity to be a little bit provocative. Media theory, I think, has been shaped, right, by within the structures of imperialism, whether intentionally or not. And this has been well established, in the work of Edward Said, or among global media scholars like Marwan Kraidi or Arman Matelart, who talk about how all of this structure of information and culture and communication are part of, infrastructure of imperialism and colonialism. And also there is this whole acts of boundary making, right? And I think if my argument is that if we try to create definition or a theory in such a way, we run the risk of reification. What it means is that we tend to reproduce the very power structures that produce this system, while also obscuring other forms of mediation and communication that fall outside of this scope. And so the goal then should not be to produce an alternative or local theory that simply sits alongside the supposedly universal Euro-American media theory. That should not happen, but rather to question the terms of universality itself and to rethink what counts as media and communication in the first place. Why is it so? It's because it is not possible to think about media and communication in Southeast Asia and anywhere actually as separate from its people, its land, its nature and ecology, and the formation of power that exists, especially in the case of Southeast Asia, the global imperialist system of power. So I think my suggestion is for in my work, is for theorizing is to have these two goals. Theorizing for these two goals. One is to critique the existing universal theory that is embedded into a system of colonialism and imperialism, and then producing knowledge that it's not just there to resist the system, but to imagine a world that is just, equal, and dignified for all, both for the humans and the non-human species. Okay, that's a lot of work, but I'm going to give you an example with my work of botanical media, right? So when we think about about telegraphy again, the sap itself is part of this tree that actually has its function. Its function is actually, it's a communication function because it transports nutrients and water from the leaves to the roots, and then from the roots through the fungi, the very small fungi, it also nourishes other species in the ecosystem, right? That is the role of this sap. But when the sap is taken out of this tree, and the tree was cut down in the 1800s en masse, millions of them was cut to insulate telegraphy, this sap was reduced only in terms of value, in the market. So the value, for example, 1 kilogram gutta percha is equal to 1,000 pounds, right? So it's removed out of this ecosystem and then moved to the market ecosystem, turned into this exchange value, right, for profit making. But then as it is created again through the advanced labor, highly skilled labor of telegraphy cable creators, it is now part of this cable infrastructure ecosystem, let's say, and it's being put then under the ocean, again entering a new ecosystem and become waste very quickly because it didn't function for more than 10 or even 15 years. So this is what I mean while thinking about, we need to be able to think beyond what exists. Right now, it's actually the world is burning. We quite literally, and we need to come up with a different way of, and also to come up with a collective agenda, really, to think about media and communication, but also its role in thinking about what's possible in the post-capitalist society, which also have been thought about, I'm sure, by the people before us, just as we imagine to think about the future. The people before us have thought about it. There are community making, there are commoning, to think about to use the word commoning versus enclosure. And Shao talk about this whole cases of enclosure today with AI and data centers, right? But commoning, Cindy Nguyen is also doing commoning with her craft work and all that, right, in her community. But with commoning, this have been done also in the past, just like, for example, the production of Lontar manuscript. So, and then of course, James Scott is another person to read if we want to talk about, practices of commoning in the past. So all of these are ways for us to unearth what's possible and what have been imagined before, for, but also as we want to fight this regime of extraction, exploitation, expropriation, etc.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rianne, for that rousing, kind of collective moment that I'm feeling right now, because we surely need to collect some questions from our audience. And for those who feel like they want to ask a question, to the speakers, please feel free to raise your hands, and then if you feel comfortable, switching on your cameras and also just raising the question by itself. For those who feel a little bit more shy, I can also look at the chat. I think we have about time for 2 very quick questions. Yeah, do folks have anything to ask? If not, I might also return to my collection of questions I have for this wonderful speakers. I might let folks think about the next question for themselves for a while, but maybe one thing I would love to do, and also only because I'm personally invested in this and for selfish reasons, given that I'm studying now data centers in both in Atlanta and Georgia, as well as in Johor and Singapore. I'm really interested in the question around publics, right? And I know that one of us here have definitely written a lot about publics, but I see that resonant in both Shao and Rianne's work, right? This question around how to create a collective agenda, how do we think about ways that new media art forms are not just subsumed, right, under the dominant means of production, right? What does it mean to create a publics around a commons that is, gradually actually being extracted and used as we are? So the means, in other words, the means of production, right? I mean, the way that we are using Zoom right now together and create a collective agenda is also precisely the same medium that is, reliant on our resources, right? Our raw materials, however you want to call it, right? So here we really have this kind of classic dual use of technology, really showing its 2 ends. And I'm really interested, like what kind of publics is possible when the exact tool, right, that we are, so keen on using to create some form of collective formation or collectivizing, it's also precisely the one that is used to create a dominant means of production, right? What kind of logics should we pay attention to? And I'm here obviously only thinking mostly about AI, but I'm sure there are other technologies that we can think about. And then I saw that David also have a question in chat that might connect to this, which is, what criticisms might someone make about connecting colonialism, right, too directly with modern AI and digital technology, right? So I think this is kind of resonant with the previous question, but perhaps all of us can think a little bit about, sort of the question I have about this dual use of technology, and also, this kind of keen relationship between, making cursory arguments about colonialism as creating a same, structure of power within modern AI and digital technologies. I don't know if anybody wants to take that question first.
I'll take it first, as I think Shao and Cindy, just very quickly. In my book, in my first book, I talk about circuit of struggle and circuit of capital, which actually is rooted in the same infrastructure and technology because they're all made by humans. So what is intended to be, and this will relate to David's question very well, in that in 1920s, if available communication technologies like newspapers, shipping lines and all that were actually was intended for colonialism, for colonial interests. But what happened was the communists, they repurposed this very means of communication into their own means of resistance. So they used the same technology, repurposed them and used them against colonialism itself, right? So this is, and this concept of this is for Marx, basically circuits of capital, what's intended for capitalist logic is actually revert or repurpose into circuit of struggle. And so from this, when we connect colonialism too much to any technologies, AI, digital, or whatever is in the past, well, we must know that technology itself is not neutral, right? I mean, all of us would agree that it's all political. It all depends. So it is resistance is inherent in the very power itself. It doesn't occur outside of it. You know, like Marx famously say that the bourgeois supplement the working class with their own infrastructure of education, right? Because basically those schools that they create to subjugate us also become the schools that educate us to go against them. So circuit of struggle, and so this is also the creation of the very public itself. It occurs within the circuit.
I'm gonna, because I write so much about the public and I use that language so deeply, but I'm gonna answer the question kind of transparently in a sense that the public quite framework doesn't quite work. And it didn't quite work. And I had to confront that in my book, even though I write about the colonial public all the time. That's the core argument. But I mean, I stuck to it because at least how it's translated into English and like kind of the Anglo-American frameworks of publicity. And, you know, we didn't name these core white men that have shaped the field of media studies. So I won't name them, but I that was one of the challenges that it took up a lot of space for me to work against framings of a Western masculinist public, and the, you know, all the discourses about division of private and public, all that stuff that just didn't quite, like, it wasn't happening in the book. Like some of it was like imposed, but then ultimately I ended up, you know, writing another chapter on to read that really like looks at more like grassroots publics or counter publics. And if I were to retranslate it, even that probably a more accurate word that was being deployed was not public in the Anglo-American state association with the public, but it's commons. It's in Vietnamese, it's been done, it's the people. And that notion of the Binzan was much more, or the commons and the people was the conversation that was being articulated. And I think if for, yeah, so it's just like there's like a questions about like translation, and maybe this really like what, Rianne, I love what you said about like universality. Like I think there is like universal, like the public is like a perfect example of that, right? Like there is no global public, you know, like all of this is being like tied to very specific particularities and historical moments. And for me, at least, like tracing I still like, I mean, there was like discussion that public was useful in the sense of like this notion of performance. I found like really important, and collective performance and collective activity. But the root word, which has been done in commons, was what was being discussed. And I'm just gonna, you know, I'm writing on the rousing activity of thinking about kind of like the question that's on my mind as I'm thinking about commoning and what it means to imagine, is that something I was sitting on is that, you know, I study the history quite deeply, yet I was, the pleasures of now being in an interdisciplinary space is how deeply I get to read quite capaciously and being inspired by like Black futurity, Indigenous thinking, and feminist thought. You know, it's giving me this openness that I'm really excited about. And something I read was thinking about like all this conversation about world making and future making, and kind of like the impulse of it, in 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 computing classes as well, and in digital humanities. Like we're creating all these kind of imaginaries. Yeah, something that stuck with me was that, you know, thinking about like kind of the promise of future making is basically like how we envision the future is how it could shape the present, which is just like a kind of a pushing, a flipping of teleologies that has been pleasant to work with. You know, I have critiques of that too, but I've been thinking about like just the space of future making, and imagining, and how that shapes kind of present collective commenting, right? And collective organizing. So at least in praxis, in the classroom, in like even like this lab formation, and like where I'm thinking about my next research agenda, it's like, you know, like I'm imagining a future person and way of existing scholarly, and that's shaping the actions of the present.
Just quickly, thank you for the question, Cindy. I don't work too much with the concept of the public just because I feel like it has such a strong kind of presupposition of an opposition to the private, and I don't know what the private is at all. So, and as a result, I don't know what the public is. Of course, the people, the masses, the commons are gets at a more politically sharp angle of what the public, I think, is meant to evoke. But at the same time, these are all pretty vacuous without actual democratic processes, right? And it's really about the kind of access to discourse, but also to resources that makes any talk about the public and any talk about democracy actually fruitful. And with that, I will also add that, and this might or might not be linked to the criticism of an over hasty link between colonialism and contemporary AI, is that it's really difficult to think about the recuperation of a certain technology or a mode of production for resistance without a kind of class consciousness. And that's just the way in which things like Zoom, and also social media and various platforms, including, free versions of ChatGPT, make us think that it is all free for access to all, is the fundamental and most important illusion that we all labor under, right? This idea that it's a free tool, this idea that everyone can use it, and how that user approach has entirely dominated liberal discourses is something that, whoa, well done, right? Thanks for putting that hood on for so long. And that's because there's a long history of the failure of communism and so on that we don't have space to go into. But this idea that we all now have this access to the most amazing, newest technology and we can all speak our mind has totally robbed modern democracies, right? And alongside with that is the utterly unfashionable but also dirty word of class consciousness. And we see that in so many post-socialist states throughout East and Southeast Asia, right? The kind of utterly cessation of class struggle, right? That the PRC is heralding or championing, and along with other states. So I just don't think that, as a tenure professor in North America and me using Zoom, I can speak endlessly about how I am for certain struggles, but without really reconciling with my class position and doing something about it collectively. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I think we have another question in the Zoom chat, which we can end perhaps with that question and answering that question. If others have more questions, feel free to definitely put in the chat so that the speakers can look at them as well. But I'm just going to read out this last question by Wee Nyo, which is, although I agree with rejecting universality, hope I understood that right, what would scholars on the panel think about in terms of the claims of universality made to streamline communication technologies and connect the public, right? How does one appreciate the benefits of connection? I guess this relates to Shao's point around access while resisting hegemony from tech companies and state actors. And how do we get people on board the resistance if rejecting dominant forms of communication technologies like AI, Zoom, etc. excludes them more than empowers them? I don't know if any folks want to start off by answering this question.
Well, I'll have a small answer, which is we got to reclaim the means of production. And the small answer on how that is done is also like what Shao left us with. It's just like this this notion of us being users of a technology that's given to us from like an anonymous being, right? Like I think there is something that we are operating within this like what feels and is like this impossible struggle. Yet there are ways to reclaim agency, and that is redesigning technologies. There are alternative ways. There's challenges with open source methods, but there are kind of other underground grassroots ways of reclaiming that. And I try to teach that as much as possible. I try to engage with it even when I'm like, I feel like I'm a double agent, right? Like I'm working on a project right now with computer scientists about like rethinking models and prompts that deal with perpetuating cultural bias. And I'm just like, I'm spending so much time with the technology I don't believe in, but I also know that the impact of this technology is wide reaching and like multi-generational. So it's kind of this like forced learning of and kind of grappling and getting my hands messy with the technology itself.
Rianne and Shao, do you have anything to add to that about perhaps thinking about ways to reclaim agency in some such seemingly impossible times?
Well, I think, I mean, capitalism is the logic itself is everywhere. I mean, it's encroaching any parts of our living spaces. And so the fight actually, it should not just happen in one place. It shouldn't be just about creating labor union or organizing in your university or wherever your workplace is. It's actually everywhere, including, for example, using the language that we take for we take for granted. For instance, maybe instead of going on Zoom, we go outside and actually have some kind of performance, singing songs together, go karaoke or like sing, you know what I mean? Like create community, for example. But the point is, do what you can wherever you are. So it doesn't, I don't, I think it's so defeating to just say that, okay, there is nothing else I can do because I am just this one person, and that's exactly the logic that capitalism wants us to think, that we are, or you're defeated, you're alone, you cannot fight, against us. We can all be an agent of change. I guess that's what I want to say.
Great, thank you, Shao. Do you want to end us with some last few thoughts when before we end this wonderful panel on how to grab the means of production and be agents of change?
I think it's all been said. I feel like ending on agents of change is really positive. I do think education is a big, um, task that we are all capable of, and it's our bread and butter, organizing and really kind of parsing out these how dominant forms of communication come to be, and that they don't have to appear the way they did and are, and that it's not, by default or a priori, and that there are really other ways of thinking. So yeah. And one way to just, think about how they were actually scientists, American scientists working with North Vietnamese on alternative ways of cybernetics, for example, during the Vietnam War, when everything is so overdetermined by US military and computational power. Just one little incident, right? So I'll end with that.
Great, thank you. I love this panel so much because we talk about how, things are not inevitable, which is very key, and education and inquiry provides us the toolkits to understand this process of non-inevitability, non-theological ways of thinking about technology. So with that, I'd like to thank you everyone for being part of this wonderful panel on circuits of power, infrastructure, communication, data in Southeast Asia. I thank our wonderful panelists who really enriched me and my own way of thinking. And obviously for folks who are interested to perhaps get some of the information of our fellow panelists, maybe they can put down their names and emails on the chat. And Rianne, do you have some closing thoughts that we have to end off with the New York Southeast Asian?
Yeah. Yes, I would like to thank Cindy Lin for the brilliant questions, and it's so provocative, and I think it's very productive. And to my fellow panelists, speakers, Cindy Nguyen and Shaoling Ma, thank you so much for your wonderful insights and our debates. I look forward for our other panels. So folks, yeah. So and also thank you to Emily Tumale for organizing behind the scene, and New York Southeast Asia Network. Thank you everybody for coming and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.